They told me I was paranoid when I started noticing things going missing from my desk. They said I was being dramatic when I mentioned the strange looks from my coworkers. And when my sister Sarah smiled that perfect smile and assured me everything would work out, I believed her because family is supposed to have your back. But sometimes the person closest to you is the one holding the knife, and sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to discover who you really are. My name is Emma Chen, and this is the story of how my sister's lies cost me my career, my security clearance, and nearly my sanity, but ultimately led me to build something she could never take away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the exact moment I knew my life was about to change forever. It was a Tuesday morning in November, and I was sitting in my pristine office on the 15th floor of the Morrison Defense Contractors building in Arlington, Virginia. The autumn light was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across my mahogany desk, where 3 computer monitors displayed classified satellite imagery that only 12 people in the entire country were authorized to view. I was one of those 12 people, and at 28 years old, I was the youngest person ever to hold that level of security clearance in the company's 40-year history. My official title was Senior Intelligence Analyst, but what I really did was connect dots that other people couldn't see. I had this ability to look at seemingly unrelated pieces of information scattered across different databases, different time zones, different continents, and somehow my brain would find the patterns that everyone else missed. It wasn't magic, though sometimes it felt like it. It was just the way my mind worked, like solving an incredibly complex puzzle where half the pieces were hidden and the other half were deliberately placed in the wrong box. The work was everything I had ever wanted to do with my life. Every morning I woke up knowing that the analysis I provided could potentially save lives, could prevent international incidents, could make the world just a little bit safer. The weight of that responsibility never felt heavy to me. It felt like purpose. It felt like finally using my brain for something that mattered more than quarterly profits or marketing strategies or any of the corporate nonsense that most of my college friends had settled into. Getting to this position hadn't been easy. The security clearance process alone had taken 18 months of background checks so thorough that investigators had interviewed my third-grade teacher and my college roommate's mother. They had combed through every financial transaction I'd made since I was 16, every place I'd lived, every person I'd dated, every trip I'd taken outside the country. They had polygraphed me twice, asking questions that made me grateful I'd lived a relatively boring life up until that point. No drug use beyond a few experimental puffs of marijuana in college, no gambling debts, no questionable associations, no criminal record beyond a single speeding ticket when I was 19. The investigators had been particularly interested in my family, which made sense given the nature of the work. They had spoken to my parents, David and Linda Chen, who owned a small but successful accounting firm in suburban Maryland. They had interviewed my younger sister Sarah, who at 25 was already making 6 figures as a pharmaceutical sales representative. They had even tracked down my maternal grandmother, who was 83 and living in an assisted living facility in Florida, to ask her about my character and trustworthiness. Everyone had passed their interviews with flying colors. My parents were pillars of the community, active in their church, with clean financial records and a marriage that had lasted 31 years. Sarah was ambitious and successful, with no criminal history and a reputation for being charming and reliable. My grandmother had apparently told the investigators that I was the most honest child she'd ever known, someone who would return a penny if I found it on the sidewalk because keeping it would feel like stealing. The irony of that last comment would become painfully clear later. What the investigators couldn't have known, because I didn't know it myself at the time, was that my sister had always harbored a deep resentment about the paths our lives had taken. Growing up, I had been the academic achiever while she had been the social butterfly. I spent my high school years in advanced placement classes and science Olympiad competitions while she was homecoming queen and prom princess. I graduated valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Georgetown University while she had to settle for a state school and student loans. None of this had seemed to matter much when we were younger. Sarah had always been confident in her own skin, popular and outgoing in ways that I envied. She had boyfriends and party invitations and seemed to glide through life effortlessly, while I struggled with social anxiety and spent most weekends studying or reading alone in my bedroom. I thought we had found our respective lanes, that we were different types of people who were good at different things. But as we entered our late 20s, the dynamics began to shift in ways that I was too naive to recognize. My starting salary at Morrison Defense was more than Sarah made after 3 years in pharmaceutical sales. My work was intellectually stimulating and meaningful, while hers involved convincing doctors to prescribe medications they might not really need. I had health insurance, a retirement plan, and job security that came from being indispensable. She had commission-based income that fluctuated wildly and constant pressure to meet sales quotas that seemed to increase every quarter. More importantly, I had something that Sarah had always craved but never been able to achieve: respect from our parents. David and Linda Chen had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but determination and a belief that education was the key to success in America. They had worked brutal hours to build their accounting firm, sacrificing vacations and luxuries so that Sarah and I could have opportunities they never had. When I landed the job at Morrison Defense, when I received my security clearance, when I was featured in the company newsletter as Employee of the Month for the third time in 2 years, I could see the pride in their eyes in a way that Sarah's sales achievements never quite seemed to generate. It wasn't that our parents loved me more than Sarah. They loved us both fiercely and equally. But they respected the type of work I was doing in a way that they couldn't quite manage with pharmaceutical sales. To them, I was using my education to serve my country, to contribute something meaningful to society. Sarah was just trying to make money, and while they were proud of her financial success, it didn't carry the same weight as what they perceived as my patriotic service. I should have seen the signs that Sarah was struggling with this dynamic. I should have noticed the way her smile became a little more forced when our parents asked about my work at family dinners. I should have picked up on the subtle edge in her voice when she would make jokes about my top-secret spy stuff, or comment about how I was becoming too serious since I started working in intelligence. I should have realized that her frequent visits to my office, which I had interpreted as sisterly interest in my career, might have had a different motivation entirely. But I was too caught up in the excitement of finally finding my place in the world to pay attention to the warning signs. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The work was challenging enough to keep me engaged, but not so overwhelming that I couldn't excel at it. My colleagues respected my analytical abilities and sought out my input on complex cases. My supervisor, Dr. Margaret Walsh, had already hinted that I was being considered for a promotion that would make me the youngest senior analyst in the company's history. Walsh was someone I admired enormously, a brilliant woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the intelligence community at a time when it was even more male-dominated than it was now. She had a PhD in international relations from Harvard and had spent 15 years at the CIA before joining Morrison Defense. She was tough but fair, demanding but supportive, and she had taken me under her wing in a way that felt like having a professional mentor for the first time in my career. The promotion she had mentioned would come with a significant salary increase, additional responsibilities, and access to even more classified information. It would also require an upgraded security clearance, which meant another round of intensive background checks and interviews. Dr. Walsh had warned me that the process would be even more thorough this time, that investigators would be looking for any changes in my personal life, financial situation, or associations that might indicate a security risk. I wasn't worried about the investigation. My life was an open book, and if anything, I had become even more security conscious since starting at Morrison Defense. I was careful about what I said and to whom I said it. I didn't discuss my work with anyone outside the office, not even in general terms. I had stopped using social media entirely after the security briefing about foreign intelligence services using platforms like Facebook and Instagram to gather information about defense contractors. I even avoided dating anyone who wasn't a U.S. citizen, not because it was required, but because it seemed like the prudent thing to do. What I didn't realize was that someone with access to my office, someone I trusted completely, had been systematically gathering information that could be used to destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. Sarah had always been curious about my work, asking questions that seemed innocent enough at the time. She wanted to know about my daily routine, my colleagues, the security procedures at the office. She would visit me for lunch occasionally, always bringing food from whatever trendy restaurant she was trying that week, always eager to hear about what I was working on. Of course, I couldn't tell her anything specific about my actual assignments, but I would share general information about office life, about the people I worked with, about the stress and excitement of working in such a high-security environment. I thought she was just being a good sister, showing interest in my career the way I tried to show interest in hers, even though pharmaceutical sales bored me to tears. I thought her visits were about spending time together, about maintaining our relationship, even though we were both busy with our respective careers. I never imagined that she was conducting a form of reconnaissance, gathering information that she would later use against me. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Monday morning in early October. I arrived at the office to find my desk drawer slightly ajar, which was unusual because I was obsessive about keeping everything locked and organized. The drawer contained nothing classified, just personal items, like hand lotion, breath mints, and a few protein bars that I kept for late-night work sessions. But the fact that it was open bothered me because I was certain I had locked it before leaving the previous Friday. I mentioned it to my cubicle neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, an analyst who specialized in Middle Eastern affairs and had become something of a friend over the past 2 years. Tom was one of those people who noticed everything, which made him excellent at his job and occasionally annoying as a colleague. He had been at Morrison Defense for 8 years and had seen enough corporate politics and security breaches to be naturally suspicious of anything out of the ordinary. "You think someone was going through your stuff?" he asked, keeping his voice low even though we were in a secure facility where everyone had clearance to be there. "Probably not," I said, but even as I said it, I felt uncertain. I might have just forgotten to lock it on Friday. "It's been a crazy week." Tom raised an eyebrow but didn't push the issue. However, over the next few days, I started noticing other small things that seemed off. My computer mouse would be in a slightly different position than where I remembered leaving it. A pen that I always kept in a specific spot on my desk would be moved a few inches to the left. My chair height would be adjusted, which was particularly noticeable because I was short and always had to raise it to the maximum setting. Individually, these things could have been explained away.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maybe the cleaning crew was being more thorough than usual. Maybe I was misremembering details because I had been working long hours. Maybe I was becoming paranoid because of the nature of my work, seeing security threats where none existed. But taken together, the incident suggested that someone was accessing my workspace when I wasn't there, someone who was trying to be careful about not leaving obvious signs of their presence but wasn't quite careful enough to avoid detection by someone who paid attention to details. I started keeping a mental inventory of my desk setup before leaving each evening, noting the exact position of objects and the way I had arranged my papers. I began locking everything, even items that didn't really need to be secured. I started arriving at the office a few minutes earlier each morning and staying a few minutes later each evening, trying to see if I could catch someone in the act of searching my workspace. After a week of this surveillance, I was beginning to think that I really was being paranoid. Nothing else had been disturbed, and I was starting to feel foolish for suspecting my colleagues of going through my desk. These were people with security clearances, people who had been thoroughly vetted by the government, people whose careers would be destroyed if they were caught engaging in unauthorized activities. Then on a Thursday afternoon, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was working late on a particularly complex analysis involving satellite imagery from 3 different time periods when I noticed that my personal phone, which I always kept in my locked desk drawer during work hours, was showing a text message notification that I hadn't seen before. The message was from Sarah, sent about 2 hours earlier while I had been in a meeting with Dr. Walsh and several other senior analysts. The message itself was innocuous enough. "Hey, hope you're having a good day.
thinking about you, but what bothered me was that I was certain I had put my phone on silent mode before locking it in the drawer that morning. The phone was now showing that it was on vibrate mode, which meant someone had accessed it and changed the sound. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through my phone, looking for signs that someone had been going through my messages, my photos, my apps. Everything seemed to be in order, but I knew that a sophisticated intruder could access information without leaving obvious traces. More importantly, I knew that my phone contained information that could be used to compromise my security clearance even though it didn't contain anything directly related to my work. There were text messages with friends that mentioned my job in general terms. There were photos from a company picnic that showed the exterior of the Morrison Defense Building. There was my contact list, which included the personal phone numbers of several colleagues with security clearances. None of this information was classified, but in the wrong hands it could be used to build a profile of my personal and professional relationships. I sat in my office that evening, staring at my phone and trying to figure out who could have accessed it and why they would want to. The drawer had been locked, which meant someone either had a key or had picked the lock. The phone itself was password protected, but a determined person with the right equipment could potentially bypass that security. The most obvious suspects were the cleaning crew, who had access to all offices after hours. But the cleaning staff at Morrison Defense were all U.S. citizens with their own security clearances, and they were under constant surveillance while working in the building. It seemed unlikely that one of them would risk their career and their freedom to go through my personal belongings. The other possibility was that someone with legitimate access to the office was using that access for unauthorized purposes. This could be a colleague, a supervisor, or even a security guard. But again, these were all people with clearances who would face severe consequences if they were caught engaging in suspicious activities. As I was considering these possibilities, my phone buzzed with another text message from Sarah. This one read, "You've been working so hard lately, remember to take care of yourself. Maybe we should grab dinner this weekend so you can tell me about what's been keeping you so busy." Something about the timing and the wording of the message made me pause. Sarah had never shown much interest in the details of my work before, and she certainly had never expressed concern about me working too hard. If anything, she had always seemed slightly jealous of the fact that I loved my job while she seemed to view hers as a necessary evil. I started scrolling back through our recent text conversations, looking for patterns or anything else that seemed unusual. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past month, Sarah had been asking increasingly specific questions about my work schedule, my colleagues, and my office routine. She had wanted to know when I usually arrived in the morning, when I typically left in the evening, which days I worked late, which days I had meetings that would take me away from my desk. She had asked about the security procedures at the building, about whether visitors needed to be escorted, about whether I ever left confidential documents on my desk overnight. At the time, I had interpreted these questions as sisterly concern mixed with curiosity about what it was like to work in a high-security environment. Sarah had always been a social person who liked to know details about other people's lives, and I had assumed she was just trying to understand my world better so we could maintain our close relationship. But looking at the questions with fresh eyes, I realized they formed a pattern that was much more sinister. Sarah hadn't been asking about my work because she cared about me. She had been gathering intelligence, collecting information that could be used to gain unauthorized access to my workspace or to build a profile of my activities that could be valuable to someone with malicious intent. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My own sister, the person I trusted more than almost anyone else in the world, had been spying on me. I spent the rest of that evening trying to convince myself that I was wrong, that I was connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture, that paranoia was making me suspicious of the one person who had always been in my corner. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Sarah had visited my office multiple times over the past few months, always during lunch hours when the building was busy and one more visitor wouldn't attract attention. She had my personal phone number, so she would know when I was receiving text messages. She was charming and persuasive, exactly the type of person who could talk her way past security or convince someone to give her access to areas where she wasn't supposed to be. More importantly, she had motive. I had been too blind to see it before, but the signs had been there for months. The way she had reacted when I told the family about my promotion opportunities. The comments she had made about my salary and benefits package. The subtle competitiveness that had crept into our relationship as my career success became more apparent. Sarah had always been the achiever in the family when we were younger, the one who was popular and successful and seemed destined for great things. But somewhere along the way, our positions had reversed. I had become the daughter our parents bragged about, the one with the impressive job and the bright future. Sarah had become the one who was still trying to prove herself, still chasing the kind of respect and admiration that seemed to come naturally to me now. The thought that my sister might be sabotaging my career was so painful that I almost convinced myself to ignore the evidence and pretend everything was normal. It would have been easier to believe that I was being paranoid, that the small signs I had noticed were just coincidences, that Sarah's questions were motivated by genuine sisterly concern rather than something darker. But I had been trained to analyze patterns and identify threats, and everything about this situation screamed danger. If Sarah was gathering information about my work and my access to classified materials, she was either planning to use that information herself, or she was passing it along to someone else who would use it. Either way, my security clearance and my career were in jeopardy. I made a decision that night that would change everything. Instead of confronting Sarah directly, instead of giving her the chance to explain or deny what I suspected, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I would gather evidence of what she was doing and figure out why she was doing it before I took any action that couldn't be undone. It was a decision that would ultimately save my career and my reputation, but not before it cost me almost everything else I thought I could count on. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and went straight to Dr. Walsh's office. Margaret was already there, as she always was, reviewing intelligence reports with a cup of coffee that had probably been cooling on her desk since 5:30 in the morning. She looked up when I knocked on her doorframe, and I could see her immediately shift into alert mode when she saw my expression. "Emma," she said, setting down her coffee and giving me her full attention. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" I closed the office door behind me and took a seat across from her desk. Margaret and I had developed a good working relationship over the past 2 years, but this was the first time I had ever brought a personal problem to her attention. I wasn't even sure it was appropriate to involve her, but I needed advice from someone who understood the security implications of what I suspected. "I think someone has been accessing my workspace without authorization," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "And I think it might be someone in my personal life." Margaret's expression became very serious, very quickly. Unauthorized access to classified workspaces was exactly the kind of security breach that could shut down entire operations and end careers. The fact that I suspected someone in my personal life made it even more serious, because it suggested the possibility of a deliberate attempt to compromise national security rather than just a random criminal act. "Tell me everything," she said, and I could hear in her voice the same tone she used when she was analyzing a potential terrorist threat. I told her about the small signs that someone had been going through my desk, about my phone being accessed, about Sarah's increasingly specific questions about my work routine. I showed her the text messages that had seemed innocent at the time but looked suspicious in hindsight. I explained my theory that Sarah might be gathering information for reasons that had nothing to do with sisterly concern. Margaret listened without interrupting, taking notes in the precise handwriting that made her such an effective analyst. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I had told her. "This is serious, Emma," she said finally. "If someone is deliberately trying to gather information about your access to classified materials, we need to treat this as a potential security breach. Even if nothing classified has been compromised yet, the attempt itself is a federal crime." I felt my stomach drop as the full implications of the situation began to sink in. I had been thinking about this as a personal betrayal, a family problem that I needed to solve quietly and privately. I hadn't fully considered that Sarah's actions might constitute criminal behavior that would require law enforcement involvement. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we follow protocol," Margaret said. "I need to report this to the security office immediately. They'll want to interview you formally, and they'll probably want to examine your workspace and your personal devices. Depending on what they find, this could become an FBI investigation, The words FBI investigation hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always been proud of my security clearance, proud of the trust that the government had placed in me. The idea that I might be at the center of a federal investigation, even as a victim rather than a suspect, was terrifying. Will this affect my clearance? I asked, even though I was afraid to hear the answer. Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her honesty didn't. It could, she said. Security clearances can be suspended during investigations, especially when there's a possibility that classified information has been compromised. The fact that the potential breach involves a family member makes it more complicated. I felt like the world was collapsing around me. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built my adult life around, was suddenly at risk because of something my sister had done. The unfairness of it was overwhelming, but I knew that fairness wasn't the primary consideration when national security was potentially involved. There's something else you need to know, Margaret continued. If this investigation moves forward, you'll need to be completely honest about everything, even if it's painful or embarrassing. Any attempt to protect your sister or downplay her actions could be seen as obstruction of justice, which would definitely cost you your clearance. The implication was clear. I was going to have to choose between protecting my sister and protecting my career. There was no middle ground, no way to solve this quietly within the family, no possibility that everything would just go back to normal if I pretended I hadn't noticed what was happening. As I walked back to my office that morning, I felt like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff. Everything in my life was about to change, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The investigation would uncover whatever Sarah had been doing, and why she had been doing it. The truth would come out, whatever that truth turned out to be. What I didn't know yet was that the truth would be worse than anything I had imagined, and that my sister's betrayal would be deeper and more calculated than I had ever thought possible. But I also didn't know that losing everything would ultimately teach me something invaluable about my own strength, my own worth, and my own ability to rebuild when everything I thought I could count on turned out to be built on lies. The security office at Morrison Defense occupied the entire third floor of the building, and walking into it felt like entering a different world entirely. Gone were the comfortable office furnishings and warm lighting of the upper floors. Here everything was sterile and institutional, designed to remind you that serious business was conducted within these walls. Agent Patricia Monroe, from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, was waiting for me in Conference Room C, along with Morrison's head of security, James Fletcher, and a woman I didn't recognize, who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Kim from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The irony that the FBI agent shared my sister's name wasn't lost on me, and I wondered if it was some kind of cosmic joke that I was about to destroy one Sarah's life while sitting across from another one. Agent Monroe was in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of intense gaze that made you feel like she could see through any lie you might be tempted to tell. She had been investigating security breaches for 15 years, she told me, and she had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. The interview lasted 4 hours, during which they asked me to repeat my story 3 different times, each time focusing on different details and looking for inconsistencies that might suggest I was lying or omitting crucial information. They wanted to know everything about my relationship with Sarah, every conversation we had shared about my work, every time she had visited the office or asked questions about my daily routine. They asked about my financial situation, my romantic relationships, my friendships, my hobbies, anything that might provide a motive for me to compromise classified information. It was exhausting and humiliating, but I understood why it was necessary. From their perspective, I could be the actual security risk, spinning an elaborate story about my sister to cover up my own illegal activities. Family members turning on each other was a common tactic used by people who got caught selling secrets to foreign governments. They had to consider the possibility that I was the real threat, and that my accusations against Sarah were an attempt to deflect suspicion. After the interview, they confiscated my work computer, my personal phone, and even my car keys, so they could search my vehicle for any classified documents that might have been removed from the building. They suspended my security clearance pending the outcome of their investigation, which meant I couldn't access my office, couldn't review classified materials, and couldn't perform any of the duties that justified my employment. Walsh assured me that my job would be waiting for me once the investigation concluded, but we both knew that was a promise she might not be able to keep. I drove home that evening in a rental car, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The apartment I shared with my roommate Jessica suddenly felt too small, too exposed, like a place where someone might be watching me from the shadows. Jessica was a nurse who worked the night shift at Georgetown University Hospital, so she wasn't home when I arrived, which was probably for the best. I wasn't ready to explain to anyone what was happening, wasn't ready to admit that my entire career was hanging by a thread because of something my sister had done. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and forced inactivity. I couldn't go to work, couldn't access my email, couldn't even call my colleagues to find out how the investigation was progressing. I felt completely cut off from the life I had built, like I was watching everything I cared about slip away while I stood helplessly on the sidelines. I tried to occupy myself with reading, with cleaning the apartment, with long walks around the neighborhood, but nothing could distract me from the growing certainty that my career was over. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon, when Agent Monroe called to tell me that they had found evidence supporting my allegations. Security cameras in the Morrison building had captured Sarah entering the facility on 3 separate occasions over the past month, each time during lunch hours when the building was busy enough that one additional visitor wouldn't attract attention. The cameras showed her being escorted to my floor by someone the investigators hadn't identified yet, and they showed her spending significant amounts of time in areas where she had no legitimate reason to be. More damning was the evidence they found on Sarah's own devices. When they executed a search warrant on her apartment, they discovered a folder on her laptop labeled Insurance Policy that contained detailed notes about my work schedule, my colleagues' names and personal information, and photographs of classified documents that could only have been taken inside my office. The documents weren't anything that would be valuable to foreign intelligence services, but they were clearly marked as classified, which meant Sarah had knowingly been in possession of stolen government property. The photographs were what convinced me that this wasn't just about sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. Sarah hadn't taken pictures of random classified documents because she was curious about my work. She had specifically targeted documents that contained information about my access levels, my security protocols, and my areas of expertise. She was building a comprehensive profile of my professional capabilities and vulnerabilities, the kind of information that could be used to either blackmail me or frame me for a more serious security breach. Agent Monroe also told me that they had identified Sarah's contact inside Morrison Defense. It was David Park, a junior analyst who worked in the same department as me, and who had been dating Sarah for the past 3 months. David had been using his security badge to escort Sarah into the building, and had been giving her access to areas that were off-limits to visitors. He had also been providing her with information about security procedures, work schedules, and personnel files that she couldn't have obtained on her own. The personal betrayal of discovering that Sarah had been dating someone from my office was almost as painful as the professional betrayal. She had deliberately cultivated a relationship with one of my colleagues, not because she was genuinely interested in him, but because he could provide her with access to information about me and my work. David was young and naive, probably flattered by the attention of an attractive older woman who seemed fascinated by his job and intelligence. He likely had no idea that he was being manipulated, but his ignorance didn't make his actions any less damaging. When I learned about David's involvement, pieces of the puzzle that had been bothering me for weeks finally started to make sense. Sarah's sudden interest in my work had coincided with her meeting David at a bar near the Morrison building, where several of my colleagues went for happy hour on Friday evenings. Her increasingly specific questions about my daily routine had started around the time David would have been able to provide her with access to personnel schedules and security protocols. Her visits to my office had always been timed perfectly to coincide with meetings or other obligations that would take me away from my desk for extended periods. Sarah had been planning this for months, carefully gathering information and building relationships that would allow her to access classified materials without raising suspicion. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, premeditated attempt to compromise national security, and the target was her own sister. The question that haunted me was why. What could Sarah possibly hope to gain from stealing classified documents and building a profile of my security access? The documents she had photographed weren't valuable enough to sell to foreign governments, and she had to know that possessing them was a serious federal crime. Agent Monroe suggested several possibilities during our follow-up interviews, but none of them fully explained the elaborate nature of Sarah's scheme. One theory was that Sarah was planning to frame me for a security breach by planting additional classified documents in my apartment or my car, then reporting me to the authorities as a suspected spy. This would destroy my career and my reputation while positioning her as a concerned citizen who had discovered her sister's treasonous activities. It was a twisted form of revenge against the sister who had achieved the success and parental approval that Sarah felt she deserved. Another possibility was that Sarah was working with someone else, either a foreign intelligence service or a domestic criminal organization that specialized in selling government secrets. The documents she had stolen might have been intended as samples to demonstrate her access to classified information, with the promise of more valuable intelligence to follow. This would explain why she had been so systematic in her approach, and why she had taken such elaborate precautions to avoid detection. The theory that disturbed me the most was that Sarah was planning to use the classified documents to blackmail me into providing her with ongoing access to government secrets. She could have threatened to report me as a security risk unless I agreed to share classified information with her on a regular basis. This would have been a perfect crime from her perspective, allowing her to profit from my security clearance, while ensuring that I would be too afraid of exposure to report her activities. Any of these scenarios would have destroyed my life and career, but they would have done much more damage to national security if Sarah had been allowed to carry out her plans. The fact that she was my sister, someone who had grown up in the same house and shared the same values, made her betrayal feel like a fundamental violation of everything I thought I understood about family loyalty and human nature. The investigation moved quickly once the evidence started accumulating. David Park was arrested at his office on a Monday morning, charged with multiple violations of the Espionage Act, and immediately suspended from his position. Security footage showed him printing classified documents after hours and photographing restricted areas of the building with his personal phone. When confronted with the evidence, he broke down and confessed to everything, admitting that he had been manipulated by Sarah, but accepting responsibility for his actions. David's confession provided the final pieces of the puzzle that investigators needed to understand the full scope of Sarah's activities. She had been using him not just to gain access to the building, but to gather intelligence about other employees who might be vulnerable to recruitment. She had asked him for personal information about his colleagues, including their financial situations, their family relationships, and their security clearance levels. She was apparently planning to expand her operation beyond just targeting me, potentially compromising multiple analysts and building a network of sources within the intelligence community. The ambition and sophistication of Sarah's scheme was staggering. This wasn't the work of an amateur who had stumbled into espionage out of jealousy or financial desperation.
She had approached this like a professional intelligence officer, using classic recruitment techniques and operational security measures that suggested either extensive training or natural talent for clandestine activities. The FBI was investigating whether she had been in contact with foreign intelligence services, or whether she had developed these skills on her own. While all of this was unfolding, I was living in a strange state of suspended animation. My security clearance remained suspended, which meant I couldn't return to work, but I also couldn't look for another job because any position that required a background check would discover the ongoing investigation. I was essentially unemployable until the case was resolved, dependent on my savings and the generosity of friends who helped me cover expenses that my emergency fund couldn't handle. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't discuss the case with anyone except my lawyer, couldn't seek support from friends who might inadvertently compromise the investigation, couldn't even visit my parents because they were being interviewed by federal agents and any contact between us might be seen as an attempt to coordinate our stories. I felt like I was living in a bubble, cut off from all the relationships and activities that had given my life meaning. My parents were devastated when they learned about Sarah's activities. They had been interviewed multiple times by investigators who wanted to understand the family dynamics that might have contributed to her actions.
They couldn't believe that their younger daughter, the charming and successful pharmaceutical sales representative they were so proud of, had been engaged in criminal activities that could send her to federal prison for decades. The investigators had been particularly interested in our childhood, looking for signs of the resentment and competitiveness that had apparently motivated Sarah's crimes. They asked about academic achievements, parental favoritism, sibling rivalry, anything that might explain why Sarah had chosen to target me, rather than pursuing her own legitimate success. My parents struggled to answer these questions, insisting that they had loved both daughters equally and had never intended to create a competitive dynamic between us. But as the investigation progressed, details emerged that painted a picture of a family where success was measured in very specific ways and where certain types of achievements were valued more highly than others. Sarah had been popular and social, but those qualities weren't as important to our immigrant parents as academic excellence and professional prestige. She had been financially successful, but her work in pharmaceutical sales didn't carry the same moral weight as my work in national security. She had been charming and outgoing, but those personality traits were seen as secondary to the intellectual accomplishments that came more naturally to me. None of this excused what Sarah had done, but it helped explain the psychological factors that might have driven her to such extreme measures. She had spent her entire adult life trying to prove herself worthy of the same respect and admiration that I seemed to receive effortlessly. When legitimate achievement didn't provide the recognition she craved, she had chosen to pursue a path that would either elevate her or destroy me, depending on how successfully she could execute her plans. The criminal charges against Sarah were filed 6 weeks after the investigation began. She was indicted on multiple felony counts, including theft of government property, conspiracy to commit espionage, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The prosecution was seeking a sentence of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, which effectively meant that Sarah's life as she had known it was over. Even if she received the minimum sentence and served her time without incident, she would be in her 40s when she was released, with a felony record that would make it nearly impossible to rebuild her career or her reputation. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, but thankfully brief. The story of two sisters whose relationship had been destroyed by espionage and betrayal was compelling enough to attract national coverage, but the classified nature of the case meant that most of the interesting details couldn't be reported. I was identified in news reports only as the victim, while Sarah was portrayed as a pharmaceutical sales representative who used family connections to gain access to classified government facilities. The public narrative that emerged was largely favorable to me, but it was still humiliating to have my personal life dissected in newspapers and television broadcasts. Colleagues from Morrison Defense were quoted anonymously, describing me as a dedicated analyst who was betrayed by someone she trusted. Former classmates were interviewed about our relationship, sharing memories that were now being reinterpreted through the lens of criminal behavior. Even my college professors were contacted by reporters looking for insights into the psychological dynamics that had led to such a dramatic family rupture. Through all of this media coverage, I maintained a strict policy of not commenting publicly about the case. My lawyer had advised me that anything I said could potentially compromise the prosecution or be used against me if Sarah's defense team decided to claim that I had somehow provoked or encouraged her criminal activities. I wanted desperately to tell my side of the story, to explain that I had been a victim rather than a willing participant, but I had to trust that the legal system would ultimately vindicate me. The trial was scheduled for early spring, but before it could begin, Sarah's lawyer approached the prosecution with a plea deal. She was willing to plead guilty to the major charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and the opportunity to cooperate with ongoing investigations into other potential security breaches. The deal would require her to provide detailed information about her methods, her contacts, and her motivations, potentially helping the FBI prevent similar cases in the future. I had mixed feelings about the plea agreement. Part of me wanted Sarah to face the full consequences of her actions, to go to trial where all the evidence against her would be presented publicly and where a jury would render a verdict that clearly established her guilt. But another part of me was relieved that I wouldn't have to testify against my own sister, wouldn't have to sit in a courtroom and recount the details of her betrayal while she sat at the defendant's table just a few feet away. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, and I decided to attend despite my lawyer's suggestion that it might be too emotionally difficult. I needed to see Sarah face the consequences of her actions, needed to hear her accept responsibility for the crimes that had nearly destroyed my life and career. I also needed some kind of closure, some way to process the end of a relationship that had been central to my identity for 28 years. Sarah looked smaller than I remembered when she stood before the judge to enter her plea. She had lost weight during the months of investigation and legal proceedings, and her normally perfect appearance had been replaced by the pale, drawn look of someone under enormous stress. When the judge asked her to state her plea to each charge, her voice was barely audible, but the words guilty were clear enough to be recorded by the court stenographer. The sentencing was delayed pending Sarah's cooperation with ongoing investigations, but the judge made it clear that she would be facing significant prison time regardless of how helpful she proved to be. The minimum sentence under the plea agreement was 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of additional time if she failed to provide complete and truthful information about her activities. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, she turned and looked directly at me for the first time since the investigation had begun. I had imagined this moment many times over the past months, wondering what I would feel when I finally saw remorse or regret or acknowledgement in her eyes. But what I saw instead was something much more complicated, a mixture of defiance and sorrow that suggested she still believed she had been justified in her actions, even as she accepted the consequences of those actions. That look stayed with me long after I left the courthouse, and it crystallized something important about the entire experience. Sarah hadn't just betrayed my trust or endangered my career. She had revealed something fundamental about the nature of family relationships, about the ways that love and resentment could coexist, about the dangerous power of unacknowledged jealousy and competition. Her crimes had been motivated not by greed or ideological conviction, but by a desperate need to matter, to be seen as valuable and important in a world that had consistently rewarded her sister's achievements over her own. Understanding Sarah's motivations didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me begin to process the complex emotions I felt about our relationship and its devastating conclusion. I was angry about the betrayal, heartbroken about the loss of someone I had loved and trusted, and relieved that the immediate threat to my career had been eliminated. But I was also sad about the waste of Sarah's potential, about the choices she had made that had ultimately hurt her more than anyone else. In the weeks following the plea hearing, my security clearance was reinstated and I was allowed to return to work at Morrison Defense. Dr. Walsh had held my position open as promised, and my colleagues welcomed me back with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity about what I had experienced during my months away from the office. The work was the same, but I approached it with a new understanding of how precious and fragile the trust that made it possible really was. The experience had changed me in ways that I was still discovering. I was more cautious about personal relationships, more aware of the signs that someone might be using friendship or family connections for ulterior motives. I was also more grateful for the genuine support I had received from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had believed in my innocence and had helped me navigate the most difficult period of my life. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned something crucial about my own resilience and strength. I had survived the worst betrayal I could imagine, had maintained my integrity under enormous pressure, and had emerged with my career and my reputation intact. Sarah's attempt to destroy me had ultimately failed, not because I was lucky or because the system had protected me, but because I had refused to be broken by circumstances beyond my control. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 year after Sarah's sentencing. It was handwritten in her familiar looping script, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Connecticut, where she was serving her reduced sentence of 10 years. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, unsure whether I was ready to hear from the sister who had tried to destroy my life. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with apologies that felt both genuine and inadequate. Sarah wrote about the therapy sessions she was attending in prison, about the slow process of understanding the resentment and jealousy that had driven her actions. She acknowledged the pain she had caused not just to me but to our parents, to David Park, and to the national security apparatus that she had attempted to compromise. She asked for forgiveness without demanding it, recognizing that she had no right to expect redemption after what she had done. What struck me most about the letter wasn't the apology itself, but the insights Sarah shared about our childhood and the family dynamics that had shaped both of our lives. She wrote about feeling invisible whenever I achieved something academically, about the pressure to find her own path to success when academic excellence came so naturally to me. She described the growing resentment she had felt as my career flourished while hers stagnated, the way our parents' pride in my accomplishments had made her feel like a failure by comparison. None of this excused her crimes, and Sarah made it clear that she understood that, but it helped me piece together a narrative that made sense of how someone I had loved and trusted could have betrayed me so completely. The sister who had taught me to ride a bicycle and had protected me from bullies in elementary school was the same person who had systematically gathered classified information to use against me. Both versions of Sarah were real, and understanding that paradox was crucial to my own healing process. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. Instead, I carried it with me for weeks, rereading it during quiet moments and thinking about what forgiveness might look like in a situation like this. I had built a successful life despite Sarah's attempts to sabotage it, but I hadn't yet figured out how to process the complex emotions surrounding our relationship and its violent conclusion. My career at Morrison Defense had not just recovered but had flourished in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. The investigation and trial had given me a unique perspective on security vulnerabilities and human intelligence threats that made me invaluable to the organization. Dr. Walsh had promoted me to Senior Intelligence Analyst ahead of schedule, recognizing that my experience as a target of insider threats gave me insights that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training programs. I had also become something of an expert on family-based security risks, consulting with other government agencies on cases where relatives or romantic partners might pose threats to cleared personnel. It was emotionally difficult work, but it felt meaningful to help other people recognize and address the kinds of vulnerabilities that I had been blind to in my own life. Every case I worked reminded me how lucky I had been that Sarah's scheme was discovered before it could cause irreparable damage to national security. The speaking engagements had started small, presentations to security professionals about recognizing insider threats and protecting classified information from family members with hidden agendas. But word spread quickly about my unique perspective, and soon I was being invited to address larger audiences at conferences and universities. The talks were always difficult emotionally, requiring me to relive the most painful period of my life in front of strangers, but they served an important purpose in educating people about threats they might never have considered. One of the most powerful moments in these presentations came when I would show the audience photographs of the classified documents that Sarah had stolen from my office. The documents themselves weren't particularly sensitive, but seeing them displayed on a large screen always drove home the reality that real government secrets had been compromised by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. The visual impact was far more effective than any statistics or case studies in convincing people to take family-based security threats seriously. During one particularly memorable presentation at Georgetown University, a young woman in the audience asked me whether I regretted pursuing the investigation that had ultimately sent my sister to prison. It was a question I had been asked many times, but something about the way she phrased it made me pause and consider my answer more carefully than usual. The honest answer was complicated. I regretted that Sarah had chosen to commit crimes that made the investigation necessary. I regretted that our family had been torn apart by jealousy and resentment that we had never addressed directly. I regretted that 2 promising careers had been destroyed and that national security had been compromised because of personal grievances that should have been resolved through therapy rather than espionage.
But I didn't regret reporting Sarah's activities to the authorities, and I didn't regret cooperating with the investigation that had brought her crimes to light. The alternative would have been to allow her to continue gathering classified information, potentially compromising other personnel and causing far more damage to national security. My loyalty to my country and my professional obligations had to take precedence over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. That realization had been one of the most difficult aspects of the entire experience. I had been raised to believe that family came first, that blood was thicker than water, that you protected your relatives even when they made mistakes. But Sarah's actions had gone far beyond mistakes into the realm of deliberate criminal behavior that threatened the safety and security of the nation I had sworn to serve. Choosing duty over family had felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught about loyalty and love.
The therapy sessions that I had started during the investigation had helped me work through these conflicted feelings. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in treating intelligence professionals, had helped me understand that healthy family relationships were built on mutual respect and shared values, not blind loyalty that ignored harmful behavior. She had taught me that protecting Sarah from the consequences of her actions would not have been an act of love, but an act of enabling that could have led to even more serious crimes. Through therapy, I had also learned to recognize the signs of manipulation and emotional abuse that I had missed in my relationship with Sarah. The subtle put-downs disguised as sisterly concern, the way she had always managed to redirect conversations away from my achievements and toward her own struggles, the guilt trips that had made me feel responsible for her happiness and success. These patterns had been present for years, but I had interpreted them as normal sibling dynamics rather than recognizing them as attempts to control and diminish me. Understanding these patterns had helped me in all my relationships, not just with family members but with colleagues, friends, and romantic partners. I had learned to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, to set boundaries that protected my emotional well-being, and to recognize when someone might be using manipulation tactics to get what they wanted from me. These skills had made me not just a better intelligence analyst but a stronger and more confident person overall. The romantic relationship that had developed with Dr. Marcus Thompson, a counterintelligence specialist at the Defense Intelligence Agency, had been my first serious attempt at dating since Sarah's arrest. Marcus understood the unique stresses of working in the intelligence community, and he had been patient with my struggles to trust someone new after being so thoroughly betrayed by someone I had loved. Our relationship had progressed slowly, built on honest communication and mutual respect rather than the intense chemistry that had characterized my previous relationships. Marcus had been the one to suggest that I might benefit from writing about my experiences, not just for professional publications but for a broader audience that could learn from what I had been through. The idea had terrified me initially because it would require revealing details about my personal life that I had worked hard to keep private. But as I began writing, I discovered that telling my story in my own words was incredibly therapeutic and empowering. The book that eventually emerged from that writing process, titled Invisible Threats: A Sister's Betrayal and the Hidden Dangers of Family Espionage, became a bestseller that reached far beyond the national security community. Readers wrote to tell me how my story had helped them recognize manipulation in their own families, how it had given them courage to report suspicious activities, or how it had simply made them feel less alone in dealing with family members who had betrayed their trust. The financial success of the book had given me something I had never expected: true independence from both my family and my employer. While I continued to work at Morrison Defense because I loved the work, I no longer felt trapped by the need to maintain my security clearance at all costs. I had options and alternatives that gave me the freedom to make decisions based on my values rather than my fears. This newfound independence had also given me the courage to rebuild my relationship with my parents, who had been devastated by Sarah's crimes and had struggled to maintain relationships with both daughters in the aftermath. The first family dinner we shared after Sarah's sentencing had been awkward and painful, filled with careful conversations that avoided mentioning the elephant in the room. But gradually we had learned to talk openly about what had happened and how it had affected all of us. My parents had come to understand that their well-intentioned emphasis on academic achievement had created a competitive dynamic between Sarah and me that had contributed to her resentment and eventual criminal behavior. They had also recognized that their immigrant experience and cultural values had sometimes made it difficult for them to express emotional support in ways that both daughters could understand and appreciate. The therapy sessions that we had attended together had helped us develop better communication patterns and had strengthened our relationships in ways that might not have been possible without the crisis that had forced us to confront these issues. The decision to respond to Sarah's letter had taken me 3 months to make. When I finally wrote back, I kept my response brief and focused on facts rather than emotions. I acknowledged her apology and her efforts to understand her motivations, but I made it clear that forgiveness would be a long process that couldn't be rushed. I told her about my book, my speaking engagements, and my work helping other security professionals, explaining how I had transformed the worst experience of my life into something that could benefit others. I also told Sarah about the scholarship fund that I had established at Georgetown University for students pursuing careers in national security, particularly those from immigrant families who might face unique challenges in navigating the clearance process. The fund was partially supported by proceeds from my book, and it had already helped dozens of young people pursue careers that might otherwise have been financially impossible. Turning my painful experience into an opportunity to help others had been one of the most healing aspects of my recovery process. Sarah's response to my letter was shorter than her original message, but it revealed a level of genuine remorse and personal growth that gave me hope for her eventual rehabilitation. She wrote about the community service work she was doing in prison, teaching literacy classes to other inmates who had never learned to read properly. She had also started a support group for women who were dealing with the aftermath of crimes motivated by family dynamics, helping them understand and process the complex emotions that had led to their criminal behavior. Reading about Sarah's efforts to help other people gave me a glimpse of the person she might become when she was eventually released from prison. The sister who had been consumed by jealousy and resentment was learning to channel those emotions into something constructive and healing. She was still the same person who had committed serious crimes against national security, but she was also someone who was working to understand and atone for those crimes in meaningful ways. The decision to visit Sarah in prison came to me suddenly during a particularly difficult therapy session where Dr. Martinez and I were discussing the concept of closure. I had been struggling with the feeling that there were things left unsaid between us, conversations that needed to happen before I could fully move forward with my life. The visit would be emotionally challenging, but it felt necessary for my own healing process. The Federal Correctional Institution where Sarah was serving her sentence was a 3-hour drive from Washington, and I made the trip on a Saturday morning in early fall. The facility was less intimidating than I had expected, more like a college campus than the fortress-like prison I had imagined. Sarah looked healthier than she had during the trial, with some of the weight she had lost during the investigation restored and a calmness in her demeanor that suggested she was adapting to her circumstances. Our conversation lasted 2 hours and covered topics that we had never been able to discuss honestly when we were growing up in the same house. Sarah talked about the pressure she had felt to compete with my academic achievements, about the way she had interpreted our parents' pride in my career as a rejection of her own accomplishments. I shared my perspective on our childhood, explaining how her popularity and social success had made me feel inadequate and awkward, how I had used academic achievement as a way to find my own identity separate from hers. For the first time in our lives, we were able to acknowledge the different ways that we had experienced the same family dynamics, the different pressures and expectations that had shaped our choices and our relationship with each other. The conversation didn't erase the harm that Sarah had caused or resolve all the complex emotions surrounding her crimes, but it gave us both a foundation for understanding how we had arrived at such a devastating point. As I drove home from the prison that evening, I felt something that I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace about my relationship with Sarah. We would never again be the close sisters we had been in childhood, and I would never again trust her with sensitive information or vulnerable emotions. But we could potentially have some kind of relationship based on honest communication and mutual respect for the boundaries that her crimes had made necessary. The speaking engagement that changed everything came 6 months later at a conference for women in national security. I had given similar presentations dozens of times, but something about this particular audience made me decide to be more personal and vulnerable than usual. Instead of focusing primarily on the professional lessons that could be learned from my experience, I talked about the emotional journey of rebuilding my life after betrayal, about the process of learning to trust again, and about the ways that surviving trauma could ultimately make someone stronger and more resilient. The response from the audience was overwhelming. Women approached me afterward to share their own stories of family betrayal, workplace sabotage, and personal resilience. Several mentioned that hearing me talk about my experience had given them permission to be proud of their own survival rather than ashamed of what had been done to them. The conversations that followed that presentation convinced me that there was a need for more open discussion about these topics, particularly among women in high-stress, high-security careers. That realization led to the creation of the Resilience Institute, a nonprofit organization that I founded to provide support and resources for intelligence professionals who had experienced betrayal, manipulation, or other forms of personal trauma that could affect their careers and their security clearances. The institute offered confidential counseling services, peer support groups, and educational programs designed to help people recognize and address security vulnerabilities in their personal lives. The institute's work expanded beyond just supporting individual professionals to include research on family-based security threats, training programs for security personnel, and advocacy for policy changes that would better protect cleared personnel from insider threats. We partnered with universities to conduct studies on the psychological factors that motivated people like Sarah to commit espionage, and we worked with government agencies to develop better screening and monitoring procedures. 3 years after its founding, the Resilience Institute had helped hundreds of intelligence professionals navigate personal crises that could have ended their careers or compromised national security. The work was deeply satisfying because it allowed me to transform the worst experience of my life into something that could prevent others from going through similar ordeals. Every person we helped represented a potential security breach that had been prevented and a career that had been saved. The Institute's success had also given me a platform to advocate for broader changes in how the intelligence community thought about personnel security and family relationships. I had testified before congressional committees about the need for better support systems for cleared personnel, and I had worked with agency leadership to develop more nuanced approaches to evaluating security risks that took into account the complex realities of modern family dynamics. Looking back on everything that had happened, I could see how Sarah's betrayal had ultimately led me to a life that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have achieved if our relationship had remained intact. The trauma had forced me to develop resilience, empathy, and leadership skills that I might never have discovered otherwise. It had taught me to value genuine relationships over superficial family obligations, and it had given me a mission that extended far beyond my own career success. The woman I had become was someone I could be proud of, someone who had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into a force for positive change in the world. I had learned that strength wasn't about avoiding betrayal or trauma, but about how you chose to respond when those things inevitably occurred. Sarah had tried to destroy my life, but she had inadvertently given me the tools and the motivation to build something far better than what I had lost. Standing in my office at the Resilience Institute 5 years after Sarah's arrest, surrounded by thank you letters from people whose lives had been touched by our work, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The path hadn't been easy, and the scars from Sarah's betrayal would always be part of my story. But I had learned that scars could be sources of strength rather than shame, reminders of battles survived rather than evidence of weakness. The last letter I received from Sarah arrived on the anniversary of her sentencing, and it contained news that I had been hoping to hear for years. She had been accepted into a master's degree program in social work that would allow her to prepare for a career helping other people when she was eventually released from prison. The woman who had once tried to destroy her sister's career was working to build a future focused on healing and service rather than competition and resentment. I wrote back to congratulate her on this achievement and to tell her about my own latest project, a memoir that would tell the complete story of our family's journey through betrayal, trauma, and ultimate healing. The book would be difficult to write because it would require revisiting painful memories and examining my own mistakes and blind spots. But it felt like the right time to share the full truth about what we had both learned from our devastating experience. The final paragraph of my letter to Sarah contained a truth that I had only recently come to understand: what you did nearly destroyed me, but it also revealed strengths I didn't know I had. I'm grateful now for the woman I've become, even though I wish you could have found a different path to becoming the woman you're becoming. We'll never get back what we lost, but maybe we can build something new that honors both our pain and our growth. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones holding the knife, but sometimes surviving that betrayal is exactly what you need to discover who you're truly meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.